effects. Much to my surprise, there were even various references to sleep deprivation being used as a tool to treat depression. Apparently, during the interim hours of sleep debt, the subjects felt a sense of euphoria. This explained how Bella managed to remain so unbelievably collected in the face of her emotional and mental trauma, which really made me ponder the parallels between the two. And then, late one night, as this notion glittered through my mind for the umpteenth time, I connected Edward and Bella, and my palm smacked my forehead in equal parts realization and idiocy. I felt ridiculously stupid as I slouched over my desk despairingly, and shoved the newest book on sleep disorders aside. I had spent so much time focusing on Edward's sleep deprivation and nightmares, that I completely failed to consider them as being a mere side effect. Certainly, the sleep deprivation was a side effect of the nightmares, but the nightmares, they were caused by something else? Not just memories. And then I stood up and sprinted to the shelf to choose another source that I had only recently acquired when Bella arrived. With it in tow, I returned to my desk and sought a particular page. I had skimmed over the passage at the time, because it wasn't necessary for Bella. We already knew her condition in detail. If I were being truthful, I was completely out of my element. I was a general physician, and even though I had briefly breached many subjects during my time in practice and education, psychology was never my strong suit. So I used the book recommended by a far more capable colleague to guide my assumptions. Using the indicators, I lined up all of the parallels. And then I did it again, and again, and once more for the sake of certainty, and possibly hoping my assessments were faulty, but they weren't, and everything still fit. And it was just as I had feared. I was 90% confident that Edward himself suffered from a severe and chronic case of post-traumatic stress disorder. Likely since the moment this fire had occurred, he had hidden the severity of it under layers of defense, and probably his own denial. It was so obvious that I felt eternally enough for not seeing it sooner. It opened so many doors to other various related mental conditions that my head spun just contemplating them all. It was horrifying. But in many ways, it made it easier. Because even though I remained helpless, I was fairly certain of what I was dealing with. I had researched the subject of PTSD so thoroughly for me and Bella that I was completely aware of every treatment and cognitive therapy that existed in the state. The prognosis, though not excellent for such a long-term chronic case, was definitely hopeful. It unnerved me that I had seemingly overlooked something so critical and alarmingly unhealthy as it stared me right in the face for 5 years. But I couldn't make up for it, and I couldn't convince Edward that staying awake was fruitless to his condition. I had to simply be prepared. So I began readying myself for the repercussions of this new realization. I knew something would eventually occur. With a severe condition brewing with such ferocity in his mind, it was only a matter of time before it was brought to the forefront. I had no way of knowing how or when an episode would be triggered for him, as it would for Bella, but I found it hard to believe none existed. It could be added stress, something as complex as a long-term build of emotions, or it could be something completely insignificant. It was entirely unpredictable, and if my suspicions were correct, downright volatile. So unfortunately, I had to wait. I was so exhausted with waiting that the notion made me frustrated and desperate, but I had to remain patient. Because soon, very soon possibly, Edward wouldn't be capable of denying the truth, and when that day came, I would be ready to offer him every available alternative. Every alternative. The thought made me slump into my desk chair sourly. But I had been prepared for him when he was the appropriate age, and our relationship remained stronger than ever. I felt I could do the same for Edward if it meant progress. As I collected the necessary information for this conversation we would likely have in the very near future, I was met with varied feelings of anxiety and unease. It wasn't something I necessarily wanted to offer him, but if I had the option, it would only fuel his resentment for me and delay his recovery, if he ever sought it out. So I gathered the paperwork and information, and locked it securely in my desk drawer. Just like Emmett, he would come to me about this sooner or later. And I would be prepared to swallow the hurt when he did, because I had no other choice. But for now I would wait, and prepare myself in anticipation of Edward's inevitable and complete undoing. 34 days after Edward's birthday, I was busy in the hospital lounge slaving over the last of my day's charts and a hot cup of coffee when I heard my name announced on the loudspeaker.
Dr. Cullen to reception. Dr. Cullen to reception.
The soft voice was professionally sweet, and I recognized the slight twinge of annoyance in Linda's voice as she called for me with a sigh. I rose from my seat and tucked my charts away under my arm, balancing the coffee in my hands as I exited the lounge and approached the reception desk. Linda had her fingers pecking rapidly at the keyboard while I deposited the charts indifferently. She didn't offer me a glance, and I suppressed an eye roll at her juvenile maturity before I noticed someone standing before her. Esme. She met my eyes with a small smile that made me swallow thickly as I hesitantly forced my own. She looked stunning and perfect, and indecently smug at annoying the receptionist, who had made more advances toward me than I'd really care to admit. Esme walked around the desk to my side, leaning her elbow on the surface and turning to face me.
Are you free for dinner?
She whispered, and I couldn't disregard the deep sadness that penetrated her eyes as she nervously fidgeted with the visitor passes aligned on the desktop. I pursed my lips and narrowed my eyes at my shoes as I tilted my head and mulled through the possibilities of what she sought from any such engagement. I wouldn't allow myself to be strung along anymore, and I didn't want to invite the temptation the occasion would bring. But I somehow felt as though I owed her an explanation for my actions, one that I could convey while sober and emotionally untainted by disappointment in Edward's disregard for me, so I agreed with a nod and led her out of the hospital silently. We took separate cars to the small diner in town, remaining silent as we entered and chose an appropriately private location in a back booth. I was beginning to detest the booth concept altogether, but the mediocre coffee was hot and caffeinated, and I was dragging my feet from the long shift and late nights spent researching.
Tired?
She asked as she sipped her drink and frowned. I nodded, relaxing into my booth and wondering when she would just simply cut the shit, as Edward would say. Long week? I fixed my eyes on the tiles of the floor and waited. Waiting was what I did best after all. When the waitress asked for our orders, we both declined. And then I felt ridiculous for even entering a diner when neither of us intended to actually eat. We came here to engage in a private conversation, and nothing else, and this annoyed me. That's what homes were meant for. Of course, Esme never came to my home, unless it was in relation to Bella. How are Alice and Bella? I asked politely as I sipped my coffee, though I already knew the answer I sought. Alice was a perfectly functioning teenage girl, and I had learned enough about PTSD and sleep deprivation over the last month to know exactly how Bella was coping. She smiled and clasped her hands on the table.
Alice is good. Spending a lot of time with Bella.
She trailed off and her eyes grew downcast. I noticed the tight frown that followed.
Bella is much the same, I suppose. No change.
She whispered to her hands while rubbing her palms together. I wanted to say something incredibly pompous, like I told you, so I told you that you were suffocating her and just making her resent you. I told you this would all blow up in our faces. I told you it wasn't attacking the problem at its source. But I pressed my lips together and kept my opinions to myself. She wouldn't want my input anyhow. If she ever had, we wouldn't have been here, now, in this diner, feeling awkward and tiptoeing around the real matters at hand. I'm sorry to hear that, I offered, because I was, and it seemed like the most efficient method of making it known without seeming as condescending and righteous as I felt. She nodded and pursed her lips at the table, and then we were once again silent. It seemed rather pointless, bringing me here to speak about our children, as if we didn't have our own problems. I couldn't decide her intentions, and I watched as she fingered through the large bowl of condiment packets idly.
I miss you,
she whispered nearly inaudibly while her fingers began fidgeting with packets of artificial sweetener. And there it is. I remained silent as I sipped my coffee, because even though I miss her terribly, it would do no good to state my feelings now, and show my obvious weakness. It was possible I was enjoying the upper hand far too much for any respectable gentleman. Not that I necessarily cared. She sighed, and though I remained stoic on the exterior, my stomach was twisting because this conversation was either our absolution or the end of everything we had. For once, I was settling for no less, and like always, it was left up to her.
Is this about Edward?
She asked, her voice suddenly hard and pleading as my cup warmed my hands. I met her gaze and I was quite certain my eyes had grown wider than two saucers. Excuse me? I asked incredulously. Of course, I had never explained the exact reason for leaving, and the more I thought about it, the last words spoken were related to Edward and Bella, but could she really not accept that our problems were proprietary? I watched as Esme swept her wavy hair over her shoulder and laid her hands in her lap, leaning towards me with stiff shoulders in anticipation of my explanation. This has nothing to do with Edward. This is about us. I raised my eyebrows deliberately, and felt more than slightly frustrated at her confused expression. I resolved to prove my point in the most effective method possible. How do you feel about marriage, Esme? I asked as I brought my hot cup to my lips. And just as expected she darted her eyes away from my gaze, and pulled back. Pulled away. That? I said simply while my cup met the table with more force than I had intended. That is what this is about. And then I looked away. I wanted to feel smug for being so precise about her reactions, but it never arrived. I felt ashamed and ridiculous, like some schoolboy attempting to ask his girlfriend why she wouldn't accompany him to prom. So much for liberation. She didn't reply for many moments, and my coffee grew warm rather than hot as I contemplated the repercussions of another hastily disgruntled exit from a booth seat. Just as I began justifying doing so, she spoke.
I never told you about Elias's father, did I?
She mused, still fidgeting with sweetener packets, and avoiding my gaze. I nearly answered her question, which was just preposterous, because it was common knowledge between us that he was never mentioned. I hardly felt compelled to learn about any of the men from her past. I was already too lovesick for my own liking to sacrifice another shred of dignity over something as petty as jealousy. She sighed deeply, appearing determined, as she met my gaze, and raised her chin.
His name was Charles?
She spoke his name as if it was an expletive, and as expected my jealousy flared over this man I could now put a name to. Thanks. Another shred of dignity lost to my pining nature. She continued with a set jaw and distant eyes.
We were married when I was 19 and stupid.
She began determined, and then appeared suddenly weary, and I was quite shocked because I had never known she was married. And this didn't help our situation any. If anything, it made my stomach churn with more fervor. She proceeded once she regained her resolve.
He was a tyrant of sorts. When I had Alice, everything got worse.
She shook her head and darted her eyes to the sweetener, before her voice grew low and grave.
He was an awful man. He ruled me, like I was his servant. I was never allowed money or friends he didn't approve of, and if I defied him, then I'd...
She paused and chanced to glance up at me through her long eyelashes, but I had become too frozen and stunned to offer an appropriate reaction.
I'd be punished.
She finished in a whisper while avoiding my gaze. She still felt so distant, and though I was making every attempt to appear calm, I was inwardly enraged with this Charles. I wanted to find him and use my diligent scalpel skills with abundance. I remained silent, lacking the stomach for coffee, and waiting for her to continue. Always waiting. Her face suddenly transformed into a wistful expression.
I took Alice, and left the day she turned one. Charles refused to give me a divorce, but I eventually persuaded him.
One corner of her lips tucked up into a ghost of a smile.
I brought her here, and made a new life. We built it together, and I became independent, because it was safe.
She whispered, finally meeting my gaze, and dropping the packets.
It was never my intention to project my own fears on you, Carlyle.
She pleaded with her eyes and reached for my hand that had frozen around the cup. I let her take it. I probably shouldn't have.
I love my independence, and though I hold it dear, I did want to be with you. I still do.
She spoke the final words in a small and timid voice that vaguely reminded me of Bella on my dining room table. I was trying to process every bit of information and apply it to her reactions over time, because, as a clinical individual, it was the only way I could possibly comprehend, and it still wasn't helping. I had the urge to tell her I had a girlfriend in high school that had an obsessive penchant for kleptomania. "Can I check your purse, Esme?" But the more I put myself in Esme's position, the more awful I felt for her.